study session.
It
Right,
is
so let's get started with our October 2nd council study session. And to kick this meeting off, I guess I could say that Councilmember Huckabee won't be joining us today for personal reasons. And so if we are late, it's one of those things that, you know, those people that are in Rotary or Kiwanis
Late
know
again?
that if you don't know that if you don't show up for a meeting, you generally get volunteered for everything. And so Councilmember Huckabee will be blamed for us being late if on subsequent meetings if we get out of here by 6:30 today.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Moved.
excellent.
I think the second's supposed to come first.
We're not voting today, though. That's right.
I'm liking the way you're thinking.
So, Mr. City Manager, would you like to kick off the discussion on
Absolutely.
the first item?
Thank you very much. So this is our brief study session, scheduled to go until 6:30. And we have with us tonight Cheryl Paston, our Deputy Public Works Director, and Kendra Breland from Fair and Pierce to bring us up to date and have a good discussion on the TMP, otherwise known as the Transportation Master Plan. And tonight's discussion will include regionalism and regional connections. So without further ado, let me turn things over to them.
Good evening, Council. Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Cheryl Passon, Public Works. Kendra Breland and I again are here to give you another update on regional connections with the Transportation Master Plan. If you can hit. So tonight we will give you a brief project background. We'll spend probably about half of the presentation on the community outreach summary and go into more details than we've been able to do in the past. We will then transition over to the regional connections and what that landscape looks like. Kendra will also give some suggestions on ways that we can effectively partner with the many regional entities out there that are working on some portion of the transportation and transit issues from now till, forever. And then we'll talk about next steps. You have on your dais, there was a request earlier today for a list of the stakeholders that we invited as a sort of a pre-interviews for the Transportation Master Plan. So you'll see a table there, and those are the ones, again, that were invited. We weren't able to speak to all of them, but I would say we spoke to probably a good 2/3 maybe of them. So that's the list. So I will hand it over to Kendra, and she'll take you the rest of the way.
Great. And before I actually dive into some of the results, staff shared with me that we did have some questions that came up from council on components of the public outreach summary. So I was hoping I can just address those right off the bat. First of all, I understand there was a table in there that had kind of some funky coloring with respect to the comments that we received at the pop-up studios. Just wanted to clarify the color a little bit. There are 3 colors, yellow, essentially they're yellow, red, and green. Just to give you a sense, the green were essentially ideas that folks had, and it's not perfectly scientific. This is how people took them down and picked their color of their pen. The yellow was intended to be cautionary comments that members of the community had, and the red was supposed to be red flags. Now, not perfectly done, but that was what the colors were intended to be.
Kendra, sorry, can you go back? You said yellow was ideas, and then you said yellow was cautionary.
Oh, sorry, green was ideas.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
And then, I have purple. I don't have red. Is
Red, purple, yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
Thanks.
And then the stars, actually, those should have been hidden. That was really, when this was put together, that was really just some comments that we flagged that would be interesting to include on some of the slides later on as they tied well to goals. So we might be resubmitting this to staff, and we'll be taking out those asterisks because that really wasn't intentional. It was just kind of an internal flagging things we wanted to put on future slides. Some other comments that we got, I understand, I tend to refer to things as appendices. Staff has alerted me that they tend to refer to things as exhibits, so moving forward we'll do that, but they were meant to be one and the same. So, sure.
Addressed as I was scribbling my notes, the asterisks.
Yes, those were just for internal purposes. We'll be resubmitting this to staff and hiding those asterisks. Those were just really interesting comments that we thought helped make a point about some of the priorities. So they were just flagged as use them in future slides.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Well, again, and as I was sharing with staff this afternoon, I'm probably going to phase out this slide as we move into time because I recognize that council members have all seen this a number of times, and the members of the audience have really seen this. But I always like to start by thinking about what are the goals of the Transportation Master Plan, and again, focusing on providing complete connections for all modes, developing a plan that's supported by the community, and we're going to be talking about that much more in depth tonight as we talk about what we heard from the community conversation and the ideas for the Transportation Master Plan moving forward, and how those are rooted in what we have heard from your community. And then last but certainly not least is developing a plan that's fundable and implementable. And again, my focus is really on improving communities. We don't improve communities with beautiful plans that look good, nice on bookshelves, but we improve communities through plans that can be funded and implemented and get important transportation infrastructure and programs built and implemented. So going back through kind of our public outreach, I'd say the first step were really those stakeholder interviews, and Cheryl passed out kind of the list of all the folks that we reached out to. The slide here is just a smattering of some of the folks that we spoke with, but you can see that it was a pretty diverse perspective from council members and department heads, the police department, to some of these outside organizations that are really central to providing transportation services in Sammamish. So be that the school districts, be that Sound Transit and King County Metro, the fire district, and of course your neighboring cities. It was important to hear kind of what was on their mind, what are kind of their plans. We'll be talking about some of that regionalism later in the presentation. But these stakeholder interviews early on.
Kendra?
Oh, absolutely.
Who did you talk to in the adjacent cities? Was it council members? Was it city staff? Or?
It was city staff.
Okay, thank you.
So the stakeholder interviews really kind of helped us to define kind of a set of priorities early on and understand, get our arms around some of the primary issues in this community. I'd say school access, I of course do these plans all over the region. I'd say probably the concerns around school access, school transportation, its kind of interplay with your transportation system is one that's probably more front of mind in this community than others. So that was an important thing to hear, such that as we move forward with the TMP, we're keeping that on our minds, is how important it is to be thinking about the schools as a part of the solution. East-west connectivity, efficiency, safety. I don't think as council members any of this is going to catch you by surprise. But these discussions really helped us to develop a set of kind of 6 priorities for the TMP. We brought these to council in July, and I think council members generally nodded their heads, but all of you said that it was really important to hear from the community in terms of, are these the right draft priorities, and of these priorities, which ones are most important to our community? And so we brought these 6 priorities to the community. Again, safe and welcoming, seamlessly connected, reinforcing community character, efficiency, and I'll go into some of these in a little more detail in future slides, fiscal sustainability, and connecting to the region. We brought these out to the community and we said, really, what do you think? Are these the right goals? And of these priorities, which are most important to you? So kind of the focal point of our public outreach were the pop-up events that we had in mid-August. We had over 270 people attend these, and they talked to the consultant and city staff team in a variety of capacities. Some of them just filled out a survey, some of them put some words up on a board, and some had pretty in-depth conversations with us. And we find that as a part of public outreach, it's really important to go out to where the community is. A lot of them can't make the time to come to an evening event, so we found that a very effective technique is to really go out to the community members. But we recognize that even in these settings, there may be some people that were out of town during that outreach. We understand there are some people that didn't have the time to go where we were. And so we've also got an online option for folks to participate. And we included our mini poll online. And together, between the pop-ups and between our online presence, we got over 550 responses from community residents or community members in terms of kind of what they think is important from a transportation perspective. We did have a more traditional public workshop on September 7th. As you can see, our numbers were not great, but I would say that we had a large number of council members that attended and participated, and I would say that the type of feedback we got during that workshop was very high quality, if not great in number.
You had to say that.
But it's true.
She won't get her holy card otherwise.
So the mini poll, really just kind of what we had online, it featured both a priorities poll and kind of just some exercises to get people to provide kind of what their priorities were from transportation, and they got kind of a couple of choices. As I said earlier, we got a number of responses. I think the most notable thing here is that people needed to self-identify by where they lived. So almost 90% of our respondents were Sammamish residents. The other 10 were primarily unincorporated King County, so probably just outside of city limits. And it was really only a handful of respondents that lived in either Sammamish or Redmond. So that was interesting and just gives you a sense of who was responding to that. So what did we hear? This first, and I think most of the council members are going to be fairly familiar with this slide. We asked folks to kind of say, in a spectrum, if you were given a choice of two very different things, how would you invest? And I think it's really notable, first of all, that we don't have any scores of ones or zeros here, and we don't have any scores of fours or fives. Folks really, these responses here really showed that you've got a kind of robust set of perspectives in this community. So there might be slight preferences one way or the other, but there wasn't any one answer that people are feeling all on one camp or the other. So we saw some slight preferences. Clearly, commuting is front of mind for many community residents. So when we gave them the choice between focusing on reducing commute times versus improvements to local streets, there was a slight preference towards focusing on commute times. We gave people a choice between focusing on more connected streets versus diverting most of the traffic onto arterials. We saw a slight preference towards more connected streets. So again, what we saw in these survey responses is that people in the community fall all over these spectrums, and we need to be mindful of these perspectives in the TMP.
Yeah, I'm curious, when you say robust, obviously it's divided. Did that reflect a demographic that you were looking at, an age demographic, or did you see any empirical evidence as to why it's so evenly divided?
In terms of the discussions that we had, it was evident that people use the transportation system in a variety of ways. So how you answer on the more connected question might depend on whether you live along a street that you're concerned about getting more traffic on versus whether you're slogging along on 228th every single day. So I think that's kind of the case. If you look through the community outreach survey, in some places we did provide some information in terms of standard deviation and mean. These are just means on this slide right here.
But it wasn't age-related or some other demographic?
No, I don't think we actually collected that, and that's a
information.
very good question.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Mato?
So just a quick observation, because I actually dropped by one of the pop-up studios that was out here at the farmers market. And one thing that I think was missing actually from this exercise that I think we as a council body need to take into consideration when looking at this data is that there wasn't context behind any of these. You could walk up to a pop-up studio, simply fill it out without any context. And the context that I'm looking for is, as I went through and read I read every last comment that was in this packet, is that when you look at the second one about being more connected, well, at face value, of course, Yes, we want to be more connected. When you start adding context to that, which is the fact that we have a lot of streets that are not consistent with our public works standards, connectivity suddenly becomes an issue. It affects, there's the not in my backyard issue. I don't want the cars running through my neighborhood, but I want to get to work faster. And so the context is missing from some of this, which is, I think, unfortunate.
No, I think that's a really good point. We struggle in these public outreach settings of how much context we can provide without kind of snowing people with information. So one way that we try to balance that is by being there and having conversations. And some of those conversations really did get to that level. But you're right, for the typical 560 or so people that are responding to this, unfortunately, a lot of them don't have that bandwidth or that level of interest.
If I can add to Kendra's response about the demographics, we are working to actually sit down with the Sammamish Youth Board and ask them some of the same questions and actually really try to get some ideas from them from their perspective. What would it take for them to use different modes of transportation other than driving? So we're hopeful that we can schedule that sometime by the end of the year.
Thank you.
One last piece I'll hit on here is the support for transit use. So this was interesting for me that of all the responses, if you want to say one of these is more dramatically to one side versus the other, this would not have been the one that I was expecting, to be quite frank. There was generally an interest, and this bore out not just in the survey response, but in a lot of the conversations I had of interest from folks in other ways to get to work or other ways to get outside of the city of Sammamish. I was just talking to staff, and they were sharing that Metro has expanded Route 269. That's great. To be honest, I would have given this community permission to say, you know what, transit's not really particularly feasible here. So that was a surprising response. So to respond to kind of the council request of these priorities, which is most important to the community, I would say again, here we don't have, so again, we provided all of the priorities, and folks were asked to rank them in priority order from 1 to 6, 1 being most important to them, 6 being least important to them. And I would say this is probably one that solicited a fair amount of discussion with a lot of folks as they were responding to this to try to understand what do these priorities mean. The one that resonated the most with the community seemed to be that the system should be efficient and eking out as much capacity out of your existing system as possible, be it by synchronizing traffic signals to encouraging people to stagger their work or school schedules. This one got the highest score overall. The next was our discussion for tonight on regional destinations being easier to access so that folks can get to their jobs, to their lifestyle opportunities, to services more easily. The third was that it should be easier to get to places on foot, by bike, or by car, so folks looking for options and how they travel throughout the city. As you can see, there's a gradual uptick in these goals in terms of what score they got. But again, we don't have any 5s or 6s here. So I think it's really important to say that even though enhancing the character of our streets and our trails, that got the lowest score, I would say looking at these points, it clearly is very important to many members of the community. So this is just a fun little word cloud here. A word cloud is really it's just a pictorial device. We took kind of the words that we heard in the comments and you put it on a little machine online, and it really just creates this kind of graphical image here, and it sizes the words based on the number of frequency of responses. So again, this is the people's own responses, so in their own words of the people that were respondents, what they had to say. And again, these were actually only the top words that were stated. I took the and some of the less interesting words out of there. But it actually was very interesting to me that some of the words that pop out pretty high, again, school is a really big word on this on this kind of word cloud here. Transit and bus are pretty large. Clearly, Sammamish needs to think about its position in the region when you see words like lake and Issaquah and Redmond popping out. So anyways, this was just kind of telling on the types of things that are on people's minds.
What does more mean here?
Oh, that probably is a word I could have taken out. More is just the number of times that people use the word more.
Okay.
Councilmember Valderrama?
Going back one slide, if you go back, this is again similar to what Councilmember Malchow had mentioned about the issue of context on these mini pool priorities. When you go to the fiscal stability that you have as the fourth, at the workshop, Councilmember Hornish and myself were seated with most of the citizens that were there, or the few of them that were there. And it was interesting, when they addressed that issue, they felt very nervous about putting a number on it because they felt that everything should be within the framework of fiscal stability. And so without that context, I suspect that the mini polls were exactly the same, that they assume that you're not going to do things unless it's got a fiscal sustainable aspect about it. And so I just wanted to pull that out because that was an interesting comment that we were receiving from them. Also, I noticed that, again, I'll go back to on your next slide, if there was a demographic, because I noticed the word Redmond pops out more than Issaquah, so if there were more northerners on that, that may have an effect on skewing that. Thank you.
Perfect.
Just a quick comment from myself as well. I think the statistic validity is certainly questionable on the mini polls because of the demographics that you're grabbing, the situation that they were in. Because it is really interesting to me how much transit does come up in discussions as you read through the material and the priorities. It seems that there's cross references, though. Not only, even though maybe it's not statistically valid, it looks like it's coming up quite a bit. If you even look at this, transit and bus, is really something that is standing out.
Yes.
Councilmember Odell.
Yeah, I think the issues of context and statistical validity are something we need to keep definitely the forefront of our minds when we're looking at these. It's a good indicator of what people were thinking, but I hate to say that one thing is worth 4 times as much as another based on what we're seeing here. But they're all relative When I went through the comments section, I kept seeing the same thing over and over and over again, and there are about 4 or 5 major themes that came out of the comments, and I thought that part was very useful.
I really appreciate the skeptical eye with which council is taking this. That's something I try to reiterate in our work. Nothing here is statistically valid. But what we're trying to do is have a robust community conversation and try to glean, I think, those key themes that come up over and over again. That's the perfect way to look at this.
Councilmember Gerand.
Thank you. Romero brought up the comment about Redmond being bigger than Issaquah on that chart. And if you think about it, the issue is bigger in Redmond than in Issaquah. Mm-hmm. Everything funnels down to one spout in Redmond, whereas in Issaquah you have more choices. So it may have something to do with where the issues are more critical.
I agree.
Yeah, if you check the demographics, we'd be able to see this.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll continue on. So actually, this is a perfect segue to our next topic on regionalism. So again, that goal to proactively advocate for investments which improve connections to the Puget Sound region, that scored very high with your community. It was the second most, I'd say, prioritized goals in terms of the mini polls, and take that for what you will. But again, I think in terms of, that's a theme that comes over and over and over again, and it's very evident in kind of our survey or in the responses that we heard. And I thought some of them were kind of cute, so I thought I would include them. And they kind of show kind of that general sentiment of the public. Inside Sammamish is okay, but getting off the plateau or outside of the city is tough. The bottlenecks tend to be outside of the city, so widening our roads won't necessarily solve that problem. That's something I've heard from council members. How about a Lake Sammamish ferry? I loved that one, and I've heard about the bridge idea as well. So I think, it just kind of, this does show that this is not a city that exists in a vacuum. Your lifeblood is that connection to the rest of the region for those lucrative jobs that your residents are very fortunate to have. But that connection to those jobs is very challenging and something that we're really excited to be looking into as a part of this TMP. So I thought it would be good kind of foundation. We are going to move beyond these, but to talk about some of the known plans in the region. And the three most notable, connecting Washington, of course, that's WashDOT's plan for the highway system. Metro Connects, so King County Metro's plan for providing local metro transit service through 2040, and Sound Transit 3. And we'll talk a little bit about what that provides and doesn't provide for Sammamish. So from the perspective of connecting Washington, and this isn't exhaustive, of course, because I know there are some local system improvements that were funded by Connecting Washington here in Sammamish, but just some of the three kind of major things that are benefiting the city. First of all, the Front Street IJR. We don't have a construction date yet. WashDOT is just getting underway and studying that, but the Front Street IJR has got a lot of benefits from this community, not just in accessing I-90, but it's also looking at a new crossing, a local street crossing of I-90. So providing that, helping that to be less of a barrier for the city is really important. WashDOT's also, of course, looking at some more near-term improvements along 202, paving in nature. Some of this has already occurred, but those are important. And then looking back on I-90, kind of the Eastgate peak shoulder use, just eking as much capacity out of I-90 as possible. These are some of the recent investments that are bearing some benefit within this community, or will, I should say. So transitioning on to Metro Connects, these figures here just show some of the existing transit routes.
Mr. Mayor,
Sorry. Councilmember Gerand.
back on the previous one, I wanted to point out that actually there is one other big planning organization around, and that's Puget Sound Regional Council. And they're in the middle of doing the Transportation 2040 plan update. And it just came to the executive board last week. A summary. It's been through the Transportation Policy Board, and the Finance Working Group spent a long time working on it, because the projects in the plan between now and 2040 total about $200 billion. The current law revenue is about $42 billion short, so there's going to have to be some new revenue sources. And one of the major ones we focused in on is road usage charge, going more from the concept of tolling all the freeways and arterials to a road usage charge. And that's moving, the paradigm is shifting in that direction. In fact, I was at an Eastside Transportation Association meeting 2 weeks ago, and Congressman Adam Smith was there, and he agreed that he would favor a vehicle mile travel charge than a tolling. So even in the Congress, we see that there's more and more agreement that since the gas tax is becoming less viable, we have to change to something different. So the point being that as this road usage charge gets implemented, and I assume that all of you have signed up to be part of the pilot program, I'm supposed to tell you to, if you haven't, to do that.
Very nice.
As this gets implemented in the next 10 or 20 years, we should be at the table to make sure that local municipalities get their fair share of it, and it doesn't all go into the state pocket. So I think that's something that we should be aware of and stay on top of, because that's going to fund regional projects. And by the way, the major reason that Issaquah is now a regional center is you get points in the scoring for projects if you're a regional center, or if the corridor is between regional centers or a corridor to a regional center. So actually the corridors from Sammamish to Redmond or Issaquah will get points for being corridors to a regional center. So even though I express my concern about Issaquah being a regional center, there are some positive notes for it. Thank you.
Councilmember O'Dell?
Yeah, I was just going to say, too, that Eastside Transportation Partnership has put a lot of effort in the last couple of years into identifying issues around the east side, some of which are on this map, that are focal points for additional funding and legislative action in the future. And this process does feed into the PSRC 2040 process.
Okay.
Well, the point on the PSRC 2040 is very well noted. We'll get to that as kind of other regional players, but I think that's one of the most important things we need to keep our eye on, so thank you for bringing that up. So transit in Sammamish today, it's fairly limited. Here's kind of a mapping of your existing routes during the AM peak hour. Doesn't show the recent improvements to Route 269. Just distilling that down, we did a little analysis, and kind of the question is, how far can Jane travel today? And so this is a GIS-based exercise. Lots of kind of caveats that I have on the slide there. But as you look at it, blue are, kind of the places she can get in 15 or 30 minutes. The teal is within 45 minutes on transit, and the pink is what she can get to in an hour. So as you can see, big takeaways here are you can get to Bellevue, you can get to Redmond, but that's about it in an hour-long transit ride from Sammamish. So by 2025, King County Metro is very focused on how can they make their Metro Connects transit service really complement the future transit investments, the light rail investments. And so just looking out to 2025 with the investments they have envisioned paired with kind of Sound Transit's light rail investments, Jane from Sammamish can actually get to downtown Seattle within an hour, to Mercer Island with those different connections in there. So definitely an improvement. Now, my firm has worked a lot with King County Metro, and actually I personally have as well. And one thing I can say in working under the hood with Metro staff is that this plan was done at a county-wide level. They do their best. They have great staff at Metro, but it's just impossible for them to really optimize transit service for every local community, and they really welcome that input. So as part of the TMP, I'd really advise that we think about recommendations we can give to Metro to really calibrate that service to improve it for Sammamish residents, and I think that input would be well received.
Could you explain a little bit in Sammamish, when you have the different colors, how are they supposed to get to the transit? Is that assuming park and ride lots or what?
It's a mixture of park and ride, and I think there's some walk assumed in here as well. My colleague Aaron Goose is actually going to be attending the transit committee, and we can talk about this in a little more detail then.
It looks like it's at the Pine Lake Park and Ride.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it does.
So just quickly, ST3, as this council and everybody in the audience, I think, here well knows, Sammamish didn't directly get a lot from ST3. Really, the only specific item to Sammamish in the plan is the North Sammamish lot that'll provide up to 200 stalls. But as you look around the region, what's envisioned for Issaquah and what's envisioned for Redmond, there are some opportunities. I think it's really tying those together. But as a part of this plan, I think we need to look at this and say, okay, if we're given something for 200 stalls, where should that be? Also, as we think about those opportunities and the very near-term opportunities in Redmond, how can we make sure that Sammamish residents are getting as much advantage of that as possible? As was brought up by Council Member Gerend, there's a lot of regional players, so we shouldn't just focus on Metro, Sound Transit, and WashDOT. Yes, those are what sometimes we think of as the big three, but there are a lot of other very important players as we move forward looking into the future that we need to be collaborating with. The school districts, that's evident that those are very important. The East Side Transportation Partnership, Microsoft, Puget Sound Regional Council, and even thinking about partnerships with our transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. I'd say the sky is the limit on this, and so we should really be thinking about how can we work collaboratively with these organizations to make the most efficient and innovative transportation system possible.
I might say that you probably should add Bellevue to that, because
Yes.
they have a program, I think it's called ACES or something like that, which deals with automated vehicles and electric vehicles, and they're trying to put a regional electric van type system together. So I encourage them to think in terms of cities outside of Bellevue in their planning. So they should be part of this.
And I think micro transit here in Sammamish is something that has some promise, so I think that's a very well received point. So I wanted to finish off, because I know that we've got a very limited time on this agenda tonight. I wanted to talk about a few good examples of regional partnerships, and then talk about a potential example of a regional partnership that you might want to consider here in Sammamish. So first of all, I apologize for this image, which is a little blurry here. It was from the I-90 corridor study. This was produced about 10 years ago, but it was a good collaborative effort in the region where WashDOT partnered with all of the local agencies. I actually don't know if Sammamish was involved or not. I suspect you were in some capacity, but to really come up with a holistic plan for the I-90 corridor in terms of what are all those improvements that need to be met, that need to be made to meet kind of the diverse needs along this corridor. And so, as you can see, a lot of project ideas had been thought of, and a lot of these are moving forward. You can see the peak shoulder usage. You can see the Front Street IJR. So these are moving forward, and this sort of very collaborative effort tends to attract funding and tends to have a lot of regional support. The picture to the right there is actually a more recent regional effort on the 522 corridor. So that's the road that kind of goes north of Lake Washington. And what this was an example of the North Shore communities really banding together to advocate for the improvements that they wanted to see. They wanted to see high-capacity transit on 522 be added to the ST3 project list. So Kenmore, essentially one of the biggest players along the route, kind of took a leadership role. They said, you know what, we have a lot of skin in the game here, and we're gonna lead this effort. And so they really led the charge. They hired some political advisors. They hired a consultant team to really help them advocate for 522 investments. They were able to get actually a 4-city council meeting together with unanimous support among Shoreline, Lake Forest Park, Kenmore, and Bothell to really advocate for these improvements. It did make it on the ST3 project list. So that's just an example of one community recognizing we're all going to benefit from this, but somebody needs to take the lead, and they decided to do that. And one notable thing about this story is that they all knew that they were going to differ on the finer details of what happens along this corridor. At this point now the thing they have to worry about is they don't all agree about where the park and rides should be along this corridor, and they don't all necessarily agree on who gets enhanced pedestrian crossings of the corridor. But they knew that there was one thing that they all supported, and that was completion of the bat lanes throughout the corridor, and that they had to work together to advocate to get those on a regional project list. So moving to now a more Sammamish relevant example, wanted to talk about 202. So as all of you know, Redmond has their Mary Moore study that's just a small portion of 202 and where their focus is. Now, as a city, you have gotten some funds from the state to have your own SR 202 study. And I just made up, so if these lines on the map are in the wrong place, please blame me. I just kind of put some, so who knows if your envisioned boundaries are from the end of the Redmond study over to either Sahali Way or over to 244th. But your focus is probably along Sammamish's boundary. But one thing that you maybe have an opportunity to do is to really lead more of a regional vision for 202, something that might garner the attention of Fall City and other communities throughout the region. So this is an example of how this community, probably the largest community that's feeding onto 202, could be a real leader in a regional effort. So that's just one example. I'm going to actually transition now to kind of questions. Staff and I kind of brainstormed on some of these, but really our intention tonight is to be here to listen to you and get guidance as we move forward with the TMP and what your interests are from the perspective of regional connectivity.
Councilmember O'Dell?
Thank you. Kendra, would you go back to that map
Sure.
for a minute? We have, and you quite correctly point out, the opportunity for a full corridor program here. What we've been doing, Sammamish's effort has been kind of centered around the blue part of this map. Redmond's interest is in the left part with the red or the pink. We do need to combine all this into one big effort. Otherwise, we're going to have a sub-optimization of the whole thing. But we have scored a little bit of success with respect to the middle map here, and that is with help from a lot of people. We got Redmond, Sammamish, King County, and WashDOT together to do a manual synchronization of the traffic signals along SR 202 all the way from at least the Gray Barn and maybe east of that down to the 520 interchange. And even though it's manual, even though it sometimes does not function quite as well as it might, it has had a major effect already of improving the flow along that road. And there is an application in, frankly, to put an ITS, Intelligent Transportation System, which is a computerized light synchronization tool that will actually make this thing work a whole lot better. But it does run across jurisdictional boundaries, and this is where you do have to get everyone kind of around the table and focused on the same page. So thank you.
We have Councilmember Jaron, please.
Sure. On that same map, it should be pointed out that Fall City really isn't a city, so they're part of King County.
Yes.
So you're not going to have them coming to the table except
Yes.
through King County. And the other point is that 202 continues through Redmond and heads north, and the communities up north have expressed interest in talking 202. I might also point out that at Puget Sound Regional Council, in the Transportation 2040 update, they're also talking about regional centers and redefining what regional centers are. And we should stay at the table in that to make sure that the city urban centers that we're a part of stay on the table. They're talking about densities per acre, density per acre. And I brought up the question, well, are we talking about net zoning or gross zoning? Because in our town center, we have a lot of critical area. And it turns out they do gross zoning calculations. So if we say the town center is 240 acres, it's going to take 240 acres into whatever dwelling units and jobs we have there to determine our density. So we would have to gerrymander the border to, if you want to get to a certain density. I think we're probably okay, but we should keep watching that.
I'd just like to comment, I'm going to go from the road corridor to the light rail at the Redmond's Miramore study. This came up in our meeting this morning. I'd just like to comment that it says Redmond's Miramore study, but that light rail station is Sound Transit. And so our relationship with Sound Transit should be getting direct input on what that station should look like as well. I mean, obviously, we want to respect our neighborhood, our neighborhood, and Redmond being the site that this is earmarked for. But Redmond really should be cooperating not only with Sammamish, but with Fall City and with Woodinville. Anybody that's going to be commuting into that center, there should be input, and the key there is really Sound Transit. And while I think a unified look is really good, we might want to increase our direct discussions with Sound Transit.
That's a very good point.
I don't have any more lights right now. Any questions?
Can you go back to this slide?
Do you want to go back to the question slide?
I'll answer. You want feedback, right? Am I up?
Yes.
So on the first one, I think it's a pretty simple to measure how quick people can get on and off the plateau. And as you know, we're talking about concurrency and what our performance measure is in that regard. So I think those two kind of dovetail together as to how we're going to measure whatever measure we decide to use. We got to first decide what measure we're going to use and then how to measure it, right? I'm back to the same discussion we've had on that. But until we decide that, I don't know if we can even talk to how we're going to measure the local to regional connectivity. I'm a little concerned, well, I'm not concerned, but just as a comment, in the mini polls and everything, you talked about connectivity, how important that is, and I'm afraid sometimes we're not making the distinction between what I'll call internal connectivity inside of Sammamish and the regional connectivity. We saw it at the candidate forum for city council the other night. They talked about connectivity, and it went off onto the regional completely. And I think the question for those candidates was on the internal connectivity. So be careful. The only thing I want to comment is let's be careful that we know what we talk about when we use the word connectivity. Are we talking about regional or are we talking about internal?
Neighborhoods.
Yeah, exactly. Priority partner, that's easy. Redmond and Issaquah, we got to do that. But I think that kind of gets into the measure of success, frankly, if we know how we're going to measure and what we're going to measure. And the opportunities, I think we've already discussed a little bit. I actually would concur with Don's point about looking farther north on 202 versus going south to Fall City. I know many times I want to get to 5 North. I don't like 520 because I backtrack and because I'm going north to Canada or whatever. So it's like, it's frustrating to me. And 202 is not user-friendly. So if there's any way of helping that move along a little bit quicker, that would be good. And trying to integrate the ST3 into this whole process, and I think we always have to keep in mind that we're talking multimodal person. What was the term that they used up north of moving people, not so much traffic, not cars.
Yeah.
So the ST3 I think is a factor, but I am still scratching my head as to when that comes online, is that going to help or hurt the traffic modality that's being used for us in Sammamish. So timeline, I have a little concern about of how some things may actually impact our internal, and frankly, I am focused more on the internal connectivity, and that's why I say when I talk about how to measure it, it's getting people off the plateau. Once they get off the plateau, I can't help them. My job as a city council member for City of Sammamish is to be able to get them around internally inside the City of Sammamish and out of Sammamish. And then it's up to somebody else.
And next we have Councilmember Gerund.
Well, to follow up on Tom, actually, we do have to be at the table outside the city also. And that's what ETP and PSRC and SCA are all about, to use a couple acronyms. What I wanted to bring up is what you're talking about, a measure of success. We're talking about it in terms of the travel time. And INRIX is the local company that does that. So maybe we should look into what it would cost for our city to hire INRIX to give us travel times internally and say from point A to point B right at our border, and point A to point C may be Microsoft or downtown Bellevue or Seattle, so that we do have a better feel of where the congestion points are and where we should both lobby regionally and lobby locally for improvements.
Councilmember O'Dowd?
I'd like to support Don's suggestion just now that we do, in fact, actively engage with INRIX, either on our own or through some of the regional organizations we've just mentioned. We can look at the City of Sammamish and the flow issues there. We can also study the surrounding flow issues using this tool. But it will also, and this is one thing we don't have, is tell us not only what's coming into and going out of Sammamish, but what's going through Sammamish. And that we do not have a good handle on.
Next, Councilmember Valderrama, and then Deputy Mayor Malchow.
You know, I concur with the need to look internally, develop our measures, and that we also have to be looking regionally. And I guess it ties to the fourth or the third bullet out there. My concern is, to date, our two neighbors, because of the large projects that they have in the Redmond Town Center and the Central Issaquah plant, are so focused inwardly that they're myopic and not realizing that we're contributing a lot of traffic to them, and they understand that in the back of their minds, but they're not looking at if we can address our commute and our flow through their city smoother, it would alleviate a lot of their issues. And so I think the only way to do that is through the regional, to sit down and look at the overall approach. And I think that's missing, because each time we sit down with Issaquah or Redmond, they turn to their own immediate problems that they're looking at. And I think that's the best way is now regionally, because if it doesn't work there, it's not going to happen, and we're all just going to be sitting at those lights at the end of our city, backed up as we are now.
Deputy Mayor Malchow?
So I want to go back to Sound Transit and what Mayor Killer was discussing with regards to the Sound Transit platform coming in there. And I know I've said it before, but I think it would behoove us to study this closely now. In your presentation, and said 1,400 parking stalls. There's also 1,750 dwelling units going in there, and that is at Eastlake Sammamish Parkway and 202. If we are not forward thinking now about how to get if we're only getting 200 parking stalls, up to 200 parking stalls in Sammamish, we have got to figure out a better way to get folks down there to those parking stalls. And we need to think about it now, not in 2024 when light rail's already here. And then the INRIX data, I know you already seconded what he said on that, and I'm just going to pile on that I think it would be really nice to know, especially for our discussion tomorrow, how much that would cost.
Councilmember Hornish?
I'm going to pile on. INRIX, yes. I do want to clarify what I said a second ago, and I agree with what Don said as far as being at the table externally, but I think there's a big distinction between internal that we can influence directly and I shouldn't even use that word, direct influence. Internal that we can directly control, and external, all we can do is influence. So, and the priority, I think, has to be for us on the internal, and then secondarily try to influence those outside.
Great distinction, Tom.
If I could add something on Intrix, could we give the staff some direction to actually give us an idea of what some studies might look like that would be advantageous? The reason I'm saying that is we've been talking about this really for quite a while, and we've brought up what are the cost of it a number of times. And so I'm wondering if we can actually get some information. It doesn't have to be implement something. It's get some feedback on what it would cost us for a couple of different approaches to get that information. Because I think that will make a big difference in how soon we do this if we know how much it might cost us to implement that. So frankly, I'd like to see us actually go a little further and not just pile on, that we actually give direction to get that information.
Well, I would like to suggest that we begin by getting INRIX in here to tell us exactly what their tools are, so we know what we're buying. We have an idea. You have one idea. I have an idea, but I don't think any of us sitting here have a complete idea
Well,
of what they can do. Maybe you do.
I think actually Kendra could be of great assistance to us on this because they have worked with INRIX on a variety of projects. So I think by tomorrow night we can probably just talk a little bit about the possibilities. We'll try to see what we could do on a typical study, what the cost of achieving the data is. But I think over time, I think everybody is on board with utilizing this. We've talked in the past about furthering our understanding, and again, it may be worthwhile having INRIX come in and chat with us, or depending on the level of expertise that Fair and Pierce has in working with them, that may be sufficient. So we'll follow up.
I
Great.
would
I
hope
think
that'd be
Council-
the earliest opportunity.
Right. I'd just like to reiterate, I think Councilmember Adele is right. The degree of knowledge about INREX also varies up here, because I have seen them before, but not really a thorough presentation. But the more we've talked about it, I've gleaned a lot of information. But I know Councilmember Odell and Councilmember Gerund, I believe, have both had specific demonstrations on it. So it would be nice to get some validity to what it is and what the options might be, and then some costs associated with it. My 2 cents there. And the other issue is jumping on to Deputy Mayor Malchow's comment about planning now for transit. Bus turnouts is something that if we're really going to be looking at transit, we should really be making sure that we're including those in the discussions of the roads. And then another comment about Councilmember Hornish. There are some things that really can affect the internal circulation in Sammamish right now without spending a penny. And that's really working with our schools to make sure that we maximize the kids getting on the buses and how the school routes work. And then right now, 269, this has really struck me in the last few days, and really part of it was by going through the material on the school districts, looking at their impact fees and starting to look at the number of students in Sammamish. If we were considering our students for the whole city, rather than being split between the two school districts, because that's how they view us and that's how we see them. Generally, if we looked at all of our students, 269 is that circulator bus, or at least the beta that we've been talking about. It runs from the north of Sammamish all the way to the south of Sammamish. I called today to actually find out that it's $1.50. If I'm a student at Skyline and I want to go to Heritage Hills, it'll cost me $1.50 to get there, or reverse. I'm coming home from a sports event, or I'm going to one, and if I ask for a paper slip, as long as I travel within 2 hours, I get my return trip included in that. So those are things that, from an internal point of view, if we get our community knowledgeable about that now that we have that service provided, we could possibly see an immediate impact without a cost to Sammamish. So I agree with you. The internal circulation is something that not only do we have to look at the long-term plan, but we really can focus on some immediate solutions that can change that. I see no other comments. Anybody else?
Have we answered the questions?
Pardon?
Have we answered your
You
questions?
did a very good job of, and I didn't intend that we'd get answers for all of them, but I think it led to a good discussion and some good direction. I think just a few reactions to a few things that were said. First of all, the discussion about 269, thinking about the schools, thinking about how the city can really be kind of maybe that leader to start that discussion. I think that's exactly the sorts of concepts that the TMP can be a real good leader and lay the foundation. And again, there's a lot of, when you start thinking about those opportunities, there's a lot of capacity here in the city that isn't being used. And I'm not talking necessarily about road capacity, but I'm talking about bus capacity, I'm talking about organizational capacity, and that's something that I think this council can really start to kind of right size and steer in the right direction. The other piece on INREX, so as you know, we have our technical meeting that's on October 11th. Travel times is going to be a big discussion on that. We can come back with some numbers. I'm actually interested in hearing about what routes does council want, and we'll do a bit of a mapping exercise during that. I would actually give a shout out to TSI. I've seen they actually have compiled some very good INREX data right about Sammamish and produced a little movie. So I don't know if Victor's coming up to the dais later tonight, but that's something you might want to ask him about. So I do know that that information exists. We worked with King County to help them set up their concurrency program. It does use INREX data, and they found it to be very inexpensive compared to their previous approach, which was having staff go and drive on all their corridors and measure travel times. So just where we're going next. Of course, we have the technical meeting next week, October 11th, and then we'll have a follow-up meeting. I think that is scheduled now for late November. We are going to
I want
become.
to interject, Deputy Mayor Malchow had a question.
She can go through this when she's finished, and I'll make my comment.
Okay. We just, I think, on the importance of the transit agencies and schools, we have focused meetings in October on those, late October on those topics. And then just a reminder that we do have kind of an end goal in sight, which is to help the city to develop a new concurrency and level of service program, looking at beginning that during the first quarter of 2018. That will also be when we start resuming some of the scenarios for the TMP and start thinking about that second pulse of public outreach.
Deputy Mayor Malchow.
Okay, so this was kind of back to what we were talking about on transportation, and I feel like we owe it to our citizens to make a plug for 269. For those that don't know what we're talking about when we say that, it is a bus route. And starting back on September 23rd, they are now having every 30 minutes during the weekday. So that's an important thing for our citizens, I think, to understand. I know our conspicuously absent council member advocated very hard for that. So that's a huge success for Sammamish, and we ought to get that out there to our citizens, that is now available, not just for the high school student that wants to travel to Heritage Hills, but for people that may not have chosen to use bus service because they couldn't get back to the plateau. Now that is an option to get back to the plateau in the middle of the day.
And if I could add on top of that, King County is planning to add weekend service in May. So they still have to go through some of their formal approvals, but that's where they're headed. So that's really great. Additional great news.
Yeah.
Newsflash.
Just another comment about the schools for scope of size, that if you look at the numbers based on the material that we were given, I don't know if I brought this up this morning in one of our meetings or not, but the city of Sammamish, if we just took of all of our students, there's about 15,000 students. That's the enrollment, and that's really not all of them. That's not Eastside Catholic or Snoqualmie. That's just the public schools between Issaquah and Lake Washington School District. Well, Issaquah School District's enrollment in the whole district is 20,000. So I'm just making a comparison of the size of the student enrollment that we have in Sammamish. Lake Washington is one of the largest school districts in the state, and their enrollment is 28,000, I believe it said in the statistics here. So at 15,000, we're actually a pretty substantial enrollment if you look at us compared to the districts in the state. So I'm not suggesting that we become a district on our own.
Why not?
But the magnitude of our enrollment in Sammamish in a condensed area is a significant area that we should be focusing on transit and transportation. So, Councilmember Jaron.
Yeah, just one last comment. In your memorandum, you have an Exhibit 1 right in the beginning on phase outreach summary. Page 4, you talk about the challenges today, and you list the issues very well. Access to work, access to commercial areas, access to schools, which we've just discussed, access to transit, access for families. And one further one, which I've heard along the way, is that future land use changes and how they might affect traffic patterns. So somewhere that has to be discussed and considered.
It's a good addition.
Well, if there are no other comments, this concludes our presentation. We're really looking forward to seeing you all next Thursday? On the 11th for the hands-on workshop.
Councilmember Adele has a question.
Yeah, back on the school thing, I'll be happy to let Ramiro lead the charge for
For the new school
for
district.
the new
of
school
Sammamish.
district. Have
We'll
it-
save money too.
Okay. But to the mayor's point about the number of students up here, frankly, if you're looking for low-hanging fruit, solving a lot of the traffic-related issues associated with the schools, and I'm not going to say caused by them, but associated with them, will go a long way toward fixing the problems up here. An example, at 3:45 in the afternoon, I was on my way down here, and I got stuck behind a school bus who was stopping every 2 blocks on 228 with the flashing red sign. And this is, frankly, in the middle of our afternoon peak rush hour. So there's things like this that we can focus on. Also, how we get more people to walk or take the bus as opposed to being in the single occupancy car type situation. So my 2 bits here.
Good. Sorry, I cut you off there, but go ahead.
All right, so I just wanted to say thank you again for your input. That was very, very helpful. It'll help us craft the discussion next week. So we hope to see you all. Again, October 11th, that's our hands-on technical meeting on concurrency level of service. We'll definitely get into quite a bit of detail. So again, lunch will be served for the council, not for everybody. But anyways, we look forward to seeing you next week. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Kendra.
We are now 7 minutes behind schedule. So I just wanted to put that out. So next,
Okay.
Mr. City Manager.
Very good. Let me introduce Glenn Ackermoff, who will actually lead us into the introduction on this next topic. So, Glenn?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. A couple weeks ago at the last council meeting, the City Manager, Howard, requested that council revisit the transportation element, and the council agreed. So we're here tonight to follow up on that process. The staff will walk through the process, so we have a whole team here tonight to help support your discussion. One of the things that brought this up was that there were some negative impacts that staff, through their assessment through the summer, came up with. We'll highlight those and get into specific reasons behind those. You'll notice on your dais we have I think you all probably received it via email also. We updated the priority list with a color rating, which we'll talk about, a further priority rating that we'll talk about in a moment. There was also, that came from this morning's mayor meeting. We also had a request to update the matrix for the decision, or all the change matrix on all of the comp plan amendment, the actual amendment. So we started that process, but we wanted to make sure that we were able to get through it and make it a value-added exercise. So we need a little more time to get through that process, but we are currently working on it, and we started it today. So we'll provide that to you as soon as we get it done. With that, like I said, we have a whole team tonight, and I'm going to hand it off to Senior Planner Doug McIntyre to take us through the first part of the process.
Thank you, Glenn. Good evening, Mayor Keller, members of the council, and City Manager Howard. My name is Doug McIntyre. I'm a planner with the Department of Community Development, and I am here tonight because I am, as a planner, a steward of the comprehensive plan, not only the development of the comprehensive plan, but also the process to amend the comprehensive plan. So I will focus more on the process, and my colleague Cheryl Paston to my left will focus more on the substance, and together we'll hopefully capture all questions and be able to answer those effectively. So as Glenn had mentioned, we're resuming the process to review the docket proposal for the transportation element, and you have all seen this particular slide a couple times, so I'll just hit the highlights of it. But essentially, there were 8 proposals submitted at the end of 2016 in the annual amendment process application. There were ultimately 2 text amendments that were placed on the docket, and the applicant was the Department of Public Works for both of those. And both of the proposals are non-policy proposals. So these are just more in regard to technical data and background data. Now, in relation to the transportation element, the Planning Commission reviewed the proposal in June and ultimately made a recommendation to City Council to adopt an amended version, what they amended, and which is shown in your packet currently. And that ultimately will lead to, or has led to, City Council review. And you'll recall in July there was a meeting on the proposal, and it was paused for further work. And now we're ready to bring it back for City Council's review and hopefully adoption. So the good news in all of this is that even with a little bit of a pause in the process, we are still on track to amend the comprehensive plan in 2017 in relation to this proposal. And as I had mentioned in a previous session on this topic, again, there are 2 text amendments, and they are being proposed to be adopted in one consolidated ordinance. So you'll notice that we'll have a first and second reading for each proposal, and then a combined third reading of the ordinance to adopt the comprehensive plan, both docket items 1 and 2, one time in 2017. And that's to respond to a state law which requires comp plans be amended no more frequently than once per year, except under very certain narrow circumstances. So tomorrow night you will actually hear both proposals, both the transportation element as well as the element to amend the environment and conservation, the proposal to amend the environment and conservation element, utilities element, and capital facilities element. So you will hold the public hearing and then hold deliberations. The proposed adoption of the consolidated ordinance is proposed to happen on November 21st. So that's most of the process and for how we got to now.
I see questions from Councilmember Hornish.
Yes.
On the process, our code says that we can amend it up to one time per year, right?
I believe that's how it's stated, but ultimately the Growth Management Act does not allow amendments more frequently than once per year.
So
Correct.
we're not required to amend it each year. It's just that we may amend it, but only up to one time per year.
That is correct, and you're right in pointing out that kind of nuance to that the state law requires the consideration of applications once per year.
And I noticed that we have to go through SEPA submittals and get non-significance and everything. So I understand that's a long, drawn-out process. I guess my ultimate question is, what precludes us from waiting to do this amendment next year and not do another one next year?
So if I understand your question correctly, I think the risk in doing that is that if you wait for effectively what would be the 2018 docket, again, because the state law requires us to only adopt once per year, you'd have to wait till pretty close to the end of 2018, so there'd be a gap in... if we decided to do that, could we amend it in, say, March of 18? And not again in 18, it's on a calendar year basis, or is it a 12-month rolling? It's a calendar year.
Calendar year basis,
yeah.
so one time in 2017, one time in 2018. So if we were to decide to do that, I'll ask the question again. Could we wait until 18 and then not do another one? Know that we can't put anything else on the docket for 18? And I guess part of that question is, why is we can only do what's on the docket? Is that a workflow issue?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. And generally speaking, the way that comprehensive plan amendments are reviewed is that there's that two-step process where the first step being you close the application, you take what you've received at that point in the year, and you run it by Planning Commission and City Council, and you effectively set the docket, quote unquote. And that's effectively the first filter. So once you set the docket, you've said that these proposals that have made it to the docket are worthy of consideration. And that's really the first step in adopting a comp plan amendment. And then once you have a docket, you take in the following year, that entire year to go through the legislative process. And then you debate the merits and the ripeness of those proposals.
And you got to go through, get the SEPA determination of non-significance as well, which is a...
Correct. And a point about these is that SEPA has been issued for these proposals, and we have received no comments or...
Okay, thank you.
So we've also done a Department of Commerce notice as well.
Okay.
Seeing no further questions, I'll proceed to the next slide. So this is, again, a slide you've seen in the past. However, it's good to reiterate why we're doing this. Why are we doing this now? Well, one reason is to ensure that the traffic model is accurate, and one of the ways we do that is by incorporating the updated traffic count data as well as updated land use assumptions. So that's pretty important to the validity of the traffic model. It's also important to improve how the traffic model is implemented, aligning policy with practice. And one of the gaps that we've seen is that we're now going on roughly 2 years of not having data for the Klahani annexation area. The other kind of final two reasons why we're doing this now is that it relates back to level of service as well as traffic impact fees. So I will leave it at that and then turn it over to Cheryl for the...
Deputy Mayor Malchow.
Can you go back? So
Yes.
ensure the Issaquah Falls City Road project is impact fee eligible. Currently, it is not eligible. Why? Why is it not eligible?
It is not on the list right now, and I'll let...
But in the TIP that we just passed, it's not listed as a concurrency project, which means it would also not be, it's not listed as a concurrency project, which also, my understanding would be, it's also not impact fee eligible. So I'm trying to understand that bullet.
Deputy Mayor, I think I can answer that question. In order to be eligible for impact fees, you have to go through several steps. First step is getting it on a 6-year TIP to actually call it a project. The next step is to amend get it into the concurrency program, get it into the segments, get it into the point where it gets the analysis to find out if it meets all the deficiencies. So this is the second part. Third part is then doing an amendment to the ordinance for the impact fee itself. So once you meet the first two parts, it's a concurrency project, you then amend its impact fee, and then determine what the fee is, update the impact fee, and then the fourth step is to go back to the TIP every year and then change it to the concurrency project. Right now, we've only done the first step on Issaquah Falls City Road.
So in when we do the 2019 TIP, it will be listed as a concurrency project.
Granted, we do all the first three steps, yes.
Okay.
2018.
Or 2018,
No,
2019.
we did the 2019 TIP. We already did,
Yeah.
we did the 2018
Well,
TIP
that's
in
fair.
2017.
Okay.
Councilmember Hornish?
Okay, so following up on that, in our current comp plan on page T54, but it's actually table T15. And I know a lot of people don't have this, probably.
Yeah, we do. It's in our packet.
Well, it's in the packet as far as the non-red line changes. That is true. And in the packet, it's page T71, which is table T15 as well. But if you look at that project number 12, Southeast Issaquah Falls City Road, Southeast 48th Street, Klahani Drive, it says 2015-35 tip priority number 7. So that's our tip number 7 plan. And it has in the table, it has concurrency project question mark, and you check it if it is, and it's checked to be a concurrency project in our comp plan.
Well, that's what we're going through. That the process is now is to update the
It
comp
was
plan.
adopted in
into-
15.
But this isn't updated. It's like it's been sitting in there.
So in 2015, it was designated as a concurrency project in our comp plan.
Bear with me real quick. We're loading it up.
Fair enough.
So,
And I went to the non-red line because the red line gets confusing when you go to the current version.
Well, the current version, it's not marked as a red line, though.
Well, it's not marked, okay, fair enough. For the
Making
T7
it appear that it was in the
Yeah.
2015 comp plan.
Yeah, so the
Yeah.
T71 page
segments,
on
in
what we
fact.
all have in tab 8 shows that it was previously adopted as a concurrency project in our comp plan. So I'm confused.
He's scrolling.
But it is not on the TIP as a concurrency project.
Correct,
So
but it's in our
there
comp
is a-
plan as a concurrency plan, yes.
Can I go through this? I'm really going through some fuzzy memory, but it might be related, and that is, before the annexation or during the annexation time, this was put on the list as a placeholder. It was on the list and taken off. Am I correct? Is my memory?
I don't recall it being taken off.
What the problem was, it couldn't be on, but we wanted it to be listed. And the reason it couldn't be on is because we didn't own it. It wasn't part of our city.
You know,
I'm just saying, there may be something that was an anomaly with that listing.
it stayed consistently. Once we annexed it, we took off the asterisk that was put onto
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
Well,
It was adopted
always
clearly
there, and
as
then
being
There, it just had an
a
asterisk, and we
project.
took the asterisk off, and we did a special session to talk about that.
But that's not even asking the question of whether or not it's designated as a concurrency project.
That's right.
Right, all I'm doing is citing the fact that there was something this was handled.
That was fuzzy on that.
Yes,
yeah,
this
yeah.
was handled as a question at one time.
excuse me, Mayor, I know we're still looking, but you're refreshing a lot of memories of, I remember some talks about that, because obviously, when we did the 2015 update, Klahani wasn't annexed yet. And I know when we were starting to deal with all those exercises and creating all those 6-year tips, we were wanting to make sure that that was on the list, and because we knew it was going, we were obviously, feeling very positive about the annexation, but also knowing that that would be a future project. So we were essentially prepping ourselves to it. In regard to the comp plan, we never did run any models. We didn't run in any of the concurrency models or finding out any deficiencies to whether it actually is impact fee eligible. That's kind of the part we're doing right now with this, is we actually did run Issaquah Falls City with the concurrency, finding out where the existing deficiencies are or what any deficiencies we needed by the 2035 to help establish what impact fees are. But just offhand, I do recall a lot of discussions about wanting it on the list in 2015 just because of the annexation.
I mean, just when you're doing your history check, I
Yeah,
know that
we
there
will
were, I
have
believe,
to
a
do
couple
some-
of lists. As you used the term, I think is very appropriate, that it was asterisk by it or something, so.
Okay, this may not be.
We're going to talk about this tomorrow night.
We'll talk
so
about
that-
this
yeah.
tomorrow night. So we may,
And we'll have to do
Something
some,
to research and
we'll be
figure out
doing
why
some
it's
research
marked
to
as a
find out
we
where.
will,
Fair enough.
project
yeah,
here.
we will follow up. We're not making any decisions tonight, and
Right.
we will follow up with this.
Okay. Thank you.
No other questions?
I'm trying to
I'm
debate.
sure there will be.
Thinking in my mind if there is. But I think we've already highlighted that it's not concurrency on the tip, so that's the issue, even though it's a concurrency in our comp plan adopted in 2015.
You could put it on your TIP. If it's listed in your comp plan as a concurrency project, you could go
Why
on
didn't
the
we
tip
put it
without
on the
going through this
16,
exercise.
17 tip? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we have enough information so that
Yep.
we can get this answered by tomorrow?
We'll have it for you tomorrow.
Great.
So we also wanted to highlight what happens if it's not amended now. So there's the couple of main reasons up here, but I also wanted to highlight that, we'll be going over the priority list next. and we'll be looking for some direction tomorrow from you on that. We're just getting questions and getting these background items taken care of for you. I also wanted to, there's been some questions, so I wanted to bring up a couple of other items. One, we can use the 2016 counts with the old segments, so we can do that. The answer is yes to that. However, we cannot mix the data sets, so we need to make a choice between 12 or 16. So those are the two things I wanted to give you heads up. We've looked into that. There have been questions we followed up with. And we also wanted to remind you that, while this is we don't want to wait because we don't want to miss some of these opportunities. This is not written in stone. You're working on your TMP. You've got a lot of concurrency is being redone, so you have a lot of opportunities to make tweaks to this process as you move forward.
Councilmember Hornish and then Deputy Mayor Malchow.
So help me understand why we can't mix data sets. Did we not measure the fewer number of segments than we have in the current proposed amendments?
Well, the challenge comes with, I'll let the technical folks answer that, but the challenge does come with Kalahani not having the right data sets for that. And for the 2012, yes, we possibly could get them from King County, possibly, but we don't want to be, our information won't be accurate if you're trying to mix a data set in one piece of the city versus another.
Just still trying to understand it, because in the 15, without adding the new segments, that we're not adding the Kalahani segments that we want to add the data for.
Primarily.
But if we didn't add, well, and then we wouldn't be adding Kalahani at all. And that's one of the issues of why we want to do this. Okay, that's helpful. Okay.
I think Deputy Mayor Malchow has a question.
I just wanted to clarify, when you're talking about mixing data sets, I don't think we were talking about using a mix of 2012 and 2016. It was specific to the segments. So in the proposals and the transportation element, there are a lot of created segments that did not exist in the previous transportation element. So I don't know if this was your question or not, but you said, why can't we mix data sets? And I don't think we're talking about 2012. We're still talking about the 26 traffic counts, but whether or not we decide to cut up Issaquah Pine Lake Road, for example, or Sahali, where Sahali used to be 21, 22, and 23, and then 21 got divided into 4 different segments itself. So we as a council could decide for Sahali, yes, we do want to have, create more segments, and on Issaquah Pine Lake Road, we don't. Can we not mix those data sets? Or we can?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess first, we had 2012, 2014 numbers. Now we are trying to be clean with 2016 updated numbers, right? That's the one point of topic. And I think what Glenn was reiterating too, we can take the 16 numbers and we have the segments that are draft as created today. We can re-look at all that relative to the previous segments that we had and not change the numbers. I think we went from 49 to 73, okay? Some of those, and Victor's part of this group too, because there is that history part, but some of that was pulled apart for reasons like constructability. Some of the projects were so big we would never build them because we couldn't build them all at once, and they would impact too many things all at once. So the ones, you picked one, we just grabbed one. A segment on 228th used to go from all the way at Northeast 12th all the way to Southeast 8th, right? The likelihood of that being constructed all under one phase was just so enormous that part of the breaking up segments was phasing, and I think it was brought to our attention. Things are acting differently in each of these little segments all along the way on 228. So that's part of the creationism of newer segments. We understand that, the point of contention, so to speak, on those, and it's not that we have any issue per se, but that was staff's recommendation at the time is it's broken up for reasons other than just, trying to make it, smaller or easier to digest. It is constructability and actuality of constructing simple phases where it doesn't impact so much, and we can afford it all at once anyway, just like Issaquah Falls City Road is broken into phases. So that was part of the history.
Okay, so just to clarify, though, what I was asking for in this morning's meeting, which is I think we want the comparison between the existing segments that are currently adopted and be able to look at that versus the newly created segments, and what does that do?
Right, so what you have in the draft is new proposed segments and their levels of service analysis on 2016 data sets. We can take the 2016 data sets and look at the old 49 segments and reevaluate the levels of services, so you have the side-by-side comparison. Obviously not for tomorrow, but we will work on that once we assume we will move forward with some of those questions that we will answer.
The other question I have is on this like red note on the bottom that says, note, action taken now does not preclude future TMP or concurrency related policy changes. So the question that I have is that with all of the changes that are in that transportation element, the one thing that staff emphasized to us during this exercise is that we couldn't touch T8, which really is the crux of all of our issues up here. And so I would like to understand why we can't touch T8 and make changes there too. If we can do it all over the rest of the transportation element, why can't we do that?
And Stephen isn't here. I know Victor's here, and maybe he should take a stab at it prior to me taking a stab at it. But I think
I understand there's a huge ripple effect by touching that, but why can't we? Is it because it's a huge ripple effect, or is there another reason that we can't
it's a
undertake
redo of the
that?
model in a sense, right? Yeah. T8 is the table T8 is the recipe, right? This many lanes get you, or this width gets you so many cars, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah. All right. So, and I'll backtrack, kind of give you just one more piece of information on why we broke some of those segments up, is the initial request to update from 2014 to 2012. I don't remember which council members, some had concerns that how you have such a long segment. I know as I drive my car, the volumes are not the same between that 2 miles of road. So if you go back to that one very large segment, we will have the question or the job. We have 8 counts now. Which one would we use? Because that was the concern. You're using a measurement at the north end of Sahalihway to tell me how 228th works in front of town center. I don't like that. So that's kind of what generated that problem. So we'll go back to that one. Just beware that we'll have a bunch of counts. We'll have to pick the one.
I'm going to jump in here. You can go back to where you measured it in 2012, and you probably had that same count and just use that same count, that same strip.
It'll apply to that whole
It will, and it won't be
That's fine.
accurate, but that would be.
But we'll get it, and we'll have that
just the
apples to
intent
apples
was,
comparison.
that's where it came from, is someone wanted it to be more accurate, so we would just be going back to less. That's just facts. So table T8, yeah, that is your level of service. Those numbers are the policy. So that is a policy change. That's not an output of the model. That's what we're telling everyone. Here is the capacity of a roadway that we're going to measure either a traffic count against or a forecast. So T8 is a policy change, not a technical correction. How the technical correction is, if you want to remeasure and say this shoulder's 3 feet instead of 4 and then change a number, that's fine. But you can't change the value of a foot of shoulder. That's the policy. So if you're concerned about remeasuring, staff can go measure all day long and fine tune the actual capacity, but the policy stays the same, if that makes sense.
Until we change it during the
I
exercise.
think that's
that
what we're
undertaking.
questioning.
So at this point, changing the capacity number is a policy change, but if you want to change where on the street it's measured, that's administrative. You can go do that. If you don't like where the current measurements were taken, that wouldn't be a policy change.
Councilmember O'Dowd and then Councilmember, excuse me, Valderrama.
I think we are, in fact, exploring the idea of a policy change, Victor, because having spent 2 or 3 weekends trying to find stuff in the highway capacity manual myself, as has Councilmember Hornish, neither one of us have been able to find any basis for any of the numbers in T8 that refers back to some scientific thing other than perhaps the single lane capacity number. So the rest of it all was derived from something, and we don't know where.
Yeah, and I understand that. That's why it's actually defined as a policy-based capacity table, because it's not strictly engineering. There's another resource I can send staff.
I'm sorry, you broke up there. You understood and what?
Sorry, that it's been when that was done, it was not strictly engineering capacity, because we didn't want a residential street to have the same capacity as a single lane on I-5. So I can show you, I can show staff and they can share with you a federal highways functional classification table that does talk about constraining ADTs by what's called functional classification. A local street should not have the same ADT as a principal arterial or freeway. That's really what this was trying to do, and it was very unique. It was recognized by PSRC as being unique, so you won't find it. You can look in the highway capacity all day long. You'll find close to the maximum, but those ratcheting numbers, reducing the capacity for facilities that weren't there, was fairly unique to Sammamish. So if you want to change it, you have a TMP process to go through and look at some other ways of doing it. But it was developed specifically to look at how we improve those two-lane rural streets to urban streets.
When you were asking the question, Councilmember Valderrama, he was saying it was the policy, there was no engineering basis. Did you get that? On the way it was broken out, it was a policy decision.
There's again, very high-level engineering behind, again, for functional classification, the capacity of a road is based on livability or desired functions. For instance, a collector, one of those functions is for the driveways to work. Well, if you want the driveways to work, you have to restrict how much through traffic is on the road, or you'd never get out of your driveway. So that might be a good table for me to share with staff, and they can share with you as the sort of federal highways capacity limits, so the upper limit for various classifications.
Councilmember O'Dell, are you finished?
Well, I could say a lot more, but maybe I should save my thing for tomorrow.
Councilmember Hornish.
Following up from a second ago of doing these old segments and the old counts, and actually some of the things that were said earlier today versus what's in our memo, and I kind of want to rewrite the revisionist history. We actually asked for that to be done 3 months ago. So I would ask that staff get on that post-haste, because we have asked for that now over and over and over, and we still don't have it. How long do you think it'll take?
So what are you looking for?
What specifically are you asking for?
Back in
well, we
July.
just talked a second ago about using the old segments with the 2016 data and giving us that information. We asked specifically for that 3 months ago and still have not seen it.
It's just a spreadsheet exercise. I mean, I wasn't asked to do it. I don't know who if anyone was, but
It should be nothing more than pulling off a spreadsheet, that
Correct.
count,
Yep.
using the old segments. It
Yes.
shouldn't be that hard. I mean, I seriously think it could be done tomorrow. It shouldn't be that hard.
Considering it's a second reading tomorrow.
How many inputs is that? Just curious.
Well, it's 39 intersections, right?
well, and the segment's 77.
Segments, sorry.
So about 100 entries if you want. Each one has multiple entries, but
We had anticipated having it for the meeting after next.
At the study session for the, what is that, 4th, 11th?
Yeah.
No, not the 11th.
The council
10th.
meeting
10th, 17th, the second council meeting of the month. Okay, the third week. I question if we couldn't get it sooner, but you guys have a lot of other stuff on your plates, I understand. Now, I want to go back to one other thing, though. I understand the distinction of an administrative change, technical change, versus a policies change. On page T95 of our current red line that we have in our packet right now, it still says that the intersection LOS for the concurrency model is to be measured at AM, PM peak, whichever is worse. Tell me again that we're not doing that, correct? And if that is true, we're not in compliance. What we can give in our comp plan, I don't have that table written down, but we only have one table of the intersection LOS, and it's only PM peak, which is in conflict with how we say we're going to measure concurrency back on page T95. So I'm concerned that we have conflicting information in our current comp plan. And I wonder if we're trying to do a technical change, shouldn't we at least include the AM or PM peak, whichever is worse, versus just the PM peak for the intersection LOS? That would be, I think that would be a technical change.
Well,
I'll come back to that. I think that would be a technical change if we just conformed our data that we're providing as to the intersection LOS that's being measured to the AM, PM peak, whichever is worse, to comply with our policy. But if we're trying to change our policy to go from what's currently adopted as AM, PM peak, whichever is worse, to PM only, that would be a policy change, I think. Would you agree?
probably the case, but we do analyze with traffic impact analysis per project for AM. Currently, our model isn't an AM model. We have a PM model, but we have it looked at per project on an AM review basis. So a subdivision will provide a 10-page plus or minus write-up, which will show morning counts as well as the PM counts. And then we model the neighborhood in our model, which is a PM model. Does that make sense?
No. Try that again.
So the only thing the city has is a PM model. Okay, so whenever a subdivision does come in, they do provide the impact in the AM peak as well. So you have the 7 to 9 a.m. and then the 4 to 6 p.m.
So so I think I might be understanding. So if they show an AM peak as being worse than a PM peak in their prediction, you plug in that worst AM peak for a PM peak analysis.
We plug in their PM peak analysis into the PM peak model.
So where's this policy that we're supposed to be using AM, PM peak, whichever's worse? It's not meaningful, is what you're saying.
It's meaningful in the sense that their impact is, if we know it's greater in the morning, which statistically it's slim, and I don't even know off the top of our head if we have more so than not that are AM worse than PM worse. But it is reviewed in the AM, but this city has historically had a PM model, and that's the
I understand that. We drilled down on that a few months ago, that we haven't been doing what the policy was. But the policy is AM, PM peak, whichever is worse. And you're telling me we're not doing that. And if we were to conform, there was one thing in here that said we want to conform the comp plan to oh, I'm sorry, it's in this. It says, ensures policy describes practice. Well, I kind of say that's backwards. Practice should describe policy, right? I mean, we make the policy, and you look at what we set as a policy, and then decide whether or not it meets concurrency. So I'm very concerned about having a policy that says this, that you're telling me we're not using, and you're telling me we can't use it, and I'll take it one step further. And if we try to change it to what your practice is, that's a policy change that we can't make because it's more than just a technical administrative change.
And that is what we are working on going forward with our concurrency modeling. You're absolutely correct. To have that,
well,
have the council.
Answered already. They get it from the developer. They give an AM, PM analysis, but they don't use it.
Just a quick note, when we have the developers come in and look at analysis with a traffic impact analysis, they do, by practice, look at the AM and the PM, but those are determined for SEPA mitigation requirements. So when a developer comes in and they're doing frontage improvements, anything per our policy, if it's a concurrency, however it relates to impact, improving the roadway, there's essentially two sets of improvements. You have the required improvements of the roadway, putting the curb, gutter, sidewalk, improving it to an urban setting, but there's also the impacts as related directly to traffic as a result of the TIA analysis. That may be a signal improvement, that may be a turn lane. Those are actually separate, and that's per the study that a development is required by the practice. And that's where they look at the AM and the PM. Our whole concurrency program is set up on the PM as we have right now with our model.
Except for a comp plan that says AM, PM peak, whichever's worse.
So the point in there that is, again, part of the cleanup, policy T.1.4, which I'm not sure exactly what page that's on in the online version, but the policy set is on a case-by-case basis, calculate intersection level of service using PM peak hour, period.
That's in the volume 1 of the comp plan, right? I don't have that in front of me. Versus
Alternatives
volume
may
2.
be considered and utilized on a case-by-case basis. So the policies listed are not AM specific. The language in page T95 on the old version, I don't know that version, it mentions AM and PM. So the policy, in my mind, we run the model on the PM policy.
And that was changed, and we didn't change volume 2 when we changed from that AM, PM peak in the policy.
So we do review the AM, PM peak relative development. The policy does say just do it by the PM, but again, the narrative says both. Inconsistent documentation. But the policy is specific and identified as PM.
So would you agree then, if we wanted to change that in this volume 2, that we should maybe change it to the policy of PM peak only?
I would defer to the attorney, but if the policy specific
Says AM,
T.1.4
yeah.
says PM, I would think it's Scribner's error.
It's a conforming change,
working
yeah. Yeah,
and
I would
conforming
agree
in the
with that.
body of the text,
Okay.
in my opinion. We can ask Mike for sure, but I think that would clean this up.
Yeah,
today.
exactly. It might be an additional change then if we go forward with it.
And the other things, we do like to have the policy be the practice, which is why, you have the Monday through Friday issue, you have the signal analysis days of the week issue. We would love to clean that stuff up, as well as like this item here.
Understood. Okay.
For today, I know we're going towards tomorrow, which is fantastic. But again, yeah, your point is understood.
Okay.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Okay, Councilmember Odell, and then Deputy Mayor Malchow.
Well, we've moved on in the discussion from the point I was going to make, but the AM PMP thing still bothers me from the standpoint that, in looking at a lot of the detail that you provided, Steve, there is a tremendous directional imbalance in traffic flows on many of the roads. And what may work in the morning may not work in the afternoon, and vice versa. So to just look at one really concerns me that we might miss the boat in some major areas. Thanks.
Deputy Mayor?
So I have a question because I'm trying to clarify in my mind the policy changes. So Table T8 policy, can't change that during this docket process, but we can change policy at any time. But at what point, if we change that policy, does it become something that we're actually utilizing? Do we have to go back through the docket process to change the transportation element to incorporate a new Table T8, whatever that might look like? What does that look like? My concern, ultimately, is the glacial pace this is moving at.
Yeah, and I think Doug will be a better person to provide the answer. Did you hear the question, Doug?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
So my question is, when I asked about why we can't change Table T8, and it was said because that's policy, we can't change the policy through this docket process. But we as council members create policy, so we can create a new policy. Let's just say tomorrow, clearly not happening tomorrow. But at what point does it get incorporated so that we're actually utilizing that policy? Do we have to go back through the docket process to incorporate it into another transportation element next year or maybe in 2019?
So I want to, I guess, be kind of careful in the answer because I think there might be two parts to that. So I guess the underlying foundation of the comprehensive plan amendment is that City Council, through the legislative review, does have authority to adopt, reject, defer, amend these proposals as they see fit. However, I think with regard to the specific question being asked about adding a policy, the concern that we would have from a comprehensive plan standpoint is that it's not quite as easy as just adding a policy. I think we've built a web and a framework of policy that they all rely on each other. They're all somewhat connected, and there's all these levels of interconnectedness throughout, not just the transportation element, but also land use element, capital facilities plan, and so on. So without being able to do a full analysis of what that impact would be, I would be a little bit nervous to say that is something that we could do on the 2017 docket. I think the other thing that plays into it is that the city is undertaking, as you heard earlier, the transportation master plan, which might drive a more comprehensive approach to policy through the transportation element. So it could make more sense to see how that plays out and then see how this all fits together to do it at one time, as opposed to making one minor change and then coming back again and making several other policy changes. So that would be my standpoint.
So I'm not sure that quite answers my question. My question is, does this change on policy on how we measure concurrency have to go through the docket process because it's a part of the transportation element?
Yes.
So you're saying it's not going to get on the docket for this year, so we're looking at best case scenario at least a year and a half before we're going to have any changes to which we can benchmark any additional a developer would, yes. So, I mean, that's my concern. I'm going to reiterate that I'm concerned about how slow this process is moving, considering the importance of this issue.
Hornish.
following up on that and as to my earlier question, if we don't do this amendment and we wait and push our 2017 docket proposed amendment into later in 18, and that's our 18, and we don't put anything else on, could we do that?
Yes, however, the actual application deadline for the 2018 docket was today, and we received, I believe at the last count, 11 applications, so those would have to be considered as well in the 18 docket.
It would have to be what?
Considered as well. under the 18
And
docket.
well, you might want to add a 12th one then, the carryover from the 17 potentially.
Yeah, and so since this proposal was docketed under the 2017 docket, it would effectively carry
Carry over,
forward.
all right.
Correct, yeah. So again, the council, so the State Growth Management Act does provide deference to local jurisdictions through the legislative review to, again, amend, deny, adopt, defer these comprehensive plan amendments, so.
Councilmember Odell?
On the glacial pace thing, I think it's unacceptable for this council to willingly take a year and a half delay on getting going on fixing this problem. You know, we're going to have a year and a half worth of building going on and the problem will only get much worse. So frankly, again, for tomorrow night, I think we need to have a very robust discussion on this whole topic, because I do not think the voters of this city are going to sit still while we take a year and a half because of a timetable. Thank you.
There are no other questions right now? Councilmember, Councilmember Jaron beat you to the punch. Yes, he did.
Thank you. I agree with Tom O. We should address it now for the Issaquah Falls City Road and the impact fee issue. I do notice that a lot of the purple ones, it says purple items can be delayed and evaluated with the Transportation Master Plan. And I would suggest there's one on there, the second purple one, which requires developers to improve roads to adopted public works standards. I think that's basically saying we're going to get more rigid on variations to those standards. And I'm a little concerned about that because I can think of one variation that I would love to see, and that is on Lancaster, the proposed project on Lancaster to have 223rd head south as a connection. Right now, it goes through a wetland. It's a single gravel road through a wetland. To put it to our public works standards would be exorbitantly expensive. But to make it a single lane road, I saw several on my trip in Europe in towns where they actually took two-lane, two-way traffic and they narrowed it down. They put bump outs in so you could only go one lane, and it forced one direction to wait for the other to go through, and it was a very effective traffic calming in the center of town. There's no reason it can't be traffic calming down there. That's not going to be a highly used road, but to have that connectivity is in my mind, logical. So I hesitate to put this statement in here, making it more rigid. So I would support that purple one being on the Transportation Master Plan program. I don't know about the other purple ones.
Can I take a stab at that?
Councilmember Hornish?
Oh, I think we had an answer or a comment from our Public Works Director.
And thank you, Councilmember Sharon. We may have to defer to legal on this, but we do have an adopted set of public work standards. This is just another inconsistency in the comprehensive transportation element, which references the old interim public work standards. So it can be a simple cleanup. We do enact the current standards on current applications, not the old ones. But for consistency's sake, we sure would like all documents to read the same. So it is a simple one, but we were just trying to minimize what we do and don't do. The blue, of course, were related to Issaquah Falls City and those types of things. So simple ones can be added. This was just a stab at some of the comments we had heard today. So thank you.
Now, Councilmember Hornish.
And I think it's probably for you, Steve, as well. We're trying to conform or make an amendment, technical change, to say that we are referencing the 2000 HCM versus 2010. Help me understand that again, why?
I'll let the modeler
sorry.
speak if that's okay.
Sure. There's a couple different reasons. For one, the 2010 methodologies in many cases were simplified, and they come up with different answers, which is sort of unfortunate. You'd think that the two methodologies, if you looked at the same intersection, you'd get the same level of service. And with signals, they actually took the ability to model U-turns out. You have a bunch of U-turns allowed on 228th. So the 2010 methodology, we actually can't do it. We would have to do something, add some more left turns or modify the model, which we didn't think was as clean as just saying we're going to use a method that actually analyzes U-turns so we can plug them in and get a number. The other thing the 2010 version did is the roundabout methodology became ultra conservative, so that roundabouts that were designed to work under the 2000 methodology on paper don't work using the 2010 methodology. So the Washington State Department of Transportation doesn't use it yet. They are still using the 2000 methodology with some specific assumptions about the distance between vehicles and the acceptable gap. So that's why, is it creates some intersections that we can't analyze at all. And then for roundabouts, it's overly conservative to the point that most agencies don't use it.
When did we have the 2010 HCM in there as the HCM that we should be using? Was that in 15 or was it even prior? I don't have the answer to that.
It was 15.
It was 15. We adopted the 2010, but we put it in the comp plan, but we never adopted actually using it.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again,
And
practice is controlling policy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I knew about the roundabouts. I didn't know about. Why couldn't we use 2010 except for those two caveats to say for those two cases we're going to use the 2000 instead of wholesale saying we're going to use something 17 years old versus 7, and it makes no. Why would we say we're not going to use the most current manual from experts?
Well, I gave you the two reasons. The other thing is that.
But can we combine them? That's my.
You can, but the software that's used also actually looks at the corridor, and so you would then lose the effect of the U-turns corridor wide, or you'd have two models, one for the pieces of the corridor that has the U-turns and one that doesn't. You can. We've done it for some studies in other places. It's just then the next question is why are you using two methods? And so you have to explain the same thing again. I mean, it's not that one is necessarily better than the other. There are some jurisdictions that still use I think the 1970 Transportation Research Board Circular 212. It's a very simplified planning methodology that doesn't look at signal timing and other things. So it's not necessarily wrong. It's just we believe it fits what's happening here better.
Any understanding or insight as to why they took those two things out in the 2010? I mean, it's a panel of experts that for some reason said, hey, we don't need this.
Yeah, I listened to the panel of experts, and again, they wanted to simplify the methodology. But when you have a very highly loaded arterial, simplifying doesn't always get you a better answer. The next level of analysis now that's usually used for congested corridors is what's called micro-simulation, where you're actually looking one car at a time. If you want the best, that's the best, but that's $100,000 just to set up the model. So there's a cost break there. And so again, the researchers who don't put these things into practice very much said, here's a mathematical model that we like better, but a lot of practitioners, are saying, well, we don't practically like that mathematical model better.
I can understand that. Somebody asked me today, philosophy on life. I said, reality wins over theory.
So kind of some of us engineers pushed back against the researchers that said, this fits this binomial regression's better than what you were doing before. And we go, really? Because it didn't look like it.
Deputy Mayor Malchow.
Sorry, I fear we're never going to get off this slide, but I think this is a preview for what our 30 minutes for tomorrow is going to look like on this element. So I wanted to talk about the single lane that Councilmember Jaron talked about as it pertains to our adopted public works standards. And I sat in a meeting with our fire chief who talked specifically about the concessions that we make on our road standards and how they can't get fire trucks in necessarily. And I've gone down a couple of brand new roads where I'm thinking to myself, how is a fire truck going to get in and then actually get out? Since sometimes they won't go all the way down. And he called out Sammamish specifically on some of this stuff. So I think that's public safety, primary. And then I think this is helpful as far as understanding the things we need to make. I think what would have been really helpful and would probably streamline tomorrow, I know we're not going to get it for tomorrow, would be the bare minimum. And I ironically asked for this at the September 18th leadership meeting that we had, which was, what's the bare minimum we need to do in order to preserve that $11 million or whatever it is in impact fees? I think we just need the bare minimum. Right now, we have a very fat packet in front of us to go through and to try and figure out, well, what's blue in here? I can't coordinate any of this stuff, and it's going to take it's going to take a lot of time. And considering the time that I spent on the last transportation element, I see a repeat, and this is going to get strung out just by virtue of the fact that there's no way that this council sitting up here is not going to go and nitpick through every single number in this transportation element. So in order to help us move this along, I would suggest that we get what the bare minimum is pointed out in the transportation element. Already we're noticing there's a lot of changes. The numbers aren't matching up from what we had in July to here. So I'm going to reemphasize the fact that if we can be concise in how we're trying to priority level 1, okay, what does priority 1 look like inside the transportation element? I think that will help us to move this along a little faster. And then back to what Councilmember Hornish did, I did ask for that in July. I said before the break, I would really appreciate getting those numbers. And so that was, I'm just pointing out, that was July that we asked for those numbers. And again, I think that would really help to kind of move this along.
So some of these items are tied to Klahani, whether we like it or not. So staff, we need to know, we need more direction than just Klahani. Are we going to look at the 16 numbers, or do you want to leave the old numbers? Are we going to look at the new segments or the old segments so we know what Klahani and Issaquah Falls City Road are? We know, it sounds like there's an understanding the Klahani and Issaquah Falls City Road area is top priority, right? So to do that, we still need to know some of these other pieces which are listed in blue as well. So it isn't, unfortunately, I think, as simple as maybe we want it to be. I can understand, and greatly, we all know that everybody will be going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. That's fine. But some of it has to go with the other. So
It's hard to identify on this priority level sheet how that translates into the transportation element. That's the difficulty in trying to get through it.
Once we know the bulk of these items in or out, because some are related, we can then translate this into the granular level Excel spreadsheet you have in the packet for tomorrow and go from there. So that's the intent, right? Is for us as staff to get an understanding of what blue, green, or purple are going to stick at this high level, and then correlate that into the granular level change table.
Okay.
Next slide.
Thank you. I'm looking for a long meeting tomorrow.
Well, and we will,
Another one?
we as staff will talk tomorrow and see if we can simplify this down to the level that makes it easier. Perhaps just concentrate on the blue and that $11 million and those things that have to play out for that $11 million, and give you all that information as the bare minimum, kind of that base level, and see if that helps. We do have additional time worked into the system so that we don't actually have to make a decision tomorrow. We can come back and continue this
And still have a second
discussion.
reading.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. We could have a second reading, we
Third
could have a
reading.
third reading.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and continue the discussion as we move forward. Because we don't want council to adopt something that honestly they're not comfortable with. So we want to try to get you to that point at a minimum level that you're comfortable with, and go forward. And you may not get there, in which case there are implications, but we truly want to help you get there.
I appreciate that.
I'm just curious about something, because the deputy mayor has asked for this comparison. She's not looking for implementation. She's looking at comparison of the model with the old numbers and the new numbers. in that, exactly the same model.
Segments, not
Segments, but with a different comparison that really she's asking for. And so my question, is it that simple of entering those segments in, or do you have to actually run some things? Is there a process that is more involved than just putting the data in and saying go and the new numbers come up?
It is not as simple as pushing the button. There is a process.
No, but it's just pulling numbers off a spreadsheet, we said
It's
earlier.
running the model, looking at it, checking it.
Model? No.
traffic counts.
And correlate it against the 47 segments, not the.
Models here, that spreadsheet's here. So
I know.
we just have to port the numbers over, so we can probably do it tomorrow.
So,
We have to
so how
cross the
soon
segments.
tomorrow?
I know.
You're pushing it. You're pushing it, Bob.
Yeah, right.
Some clarification. Very good. Okay, Councilmember Hornet.
Yeah, I want to follow up, and I appreciate Lyman's comment that we don't want to push us to adopt something we're not comfortable with, which I hope we wouldn't do anyhow, frankly. But I'm going back to my first question. What is it that we need in the comp plan to be able to have Issaquah Falls City eligible for traffic impact fees? And if it's in there as a concurrency project, would that be sufficient potentially to be traffic impact fee eligible?
I mean, would we have already sacified it back in 2015?
That might be a caveat
We'll
and a
double check
whole,
that.
it may
We
just
will
answer
double
the
check
whole
that.
question about saving those impact fees. Potentially, is what I'm seeing. Okay.
Well, we'll answer it. I don't think so, but we'll answer it. Because we have a TIP, CIP that's adopted separate from this, again, document with more inconsistencies that doesn't have it listed as a concurrency project. But just because it was listed before, I don't think it's going to grandfather.
I'd use the same rationale in Volume 1. The policy says this.
Yeah.
If the comp plan says this, that should override the TIP, I would think.
But
We will
hopefully
check
there's
with
support.
legal.
I don't know. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
So you're going to research that, and will we have that tomorrow?
I
we
believe we
should.
could have that answered.
Okay.
If I could interject, I would guess that you still need to adopt or add the Issaquah Falls City, because when the 2015 comp plan was adopted, Klahani had not been incorporated into the city. So we didn't own, as I think Andrew may have pointed out, we did not own that road when the current comp plan was adopted.
When we adopted it, when did it become effective?
I believe it.
January 1st. That's what I would guess too.
Oh,
Yeah, we will follow up with that.
If it became
with legal.
effective at the same time it was annexed,
Yeah.
it would be effective to cover it potentially. Legal question.
If I can amend our city manager's response about the blue, we also, so just so I'm clear, are you all in approval for us to move forward with all of the blue items to revise that change log so we can detail out what the changes in blue, how that's reflected in that change log to tell you exactly what would change?
I think that's what we're looking for is
Okay.
what, the blue, what does
Right.
that look like in the transportation element? What changes occur
Okay.
if we have to do the blue?
I
Priority one.
don't think I don't want it in the log. I want a red line
Yes.
to the current comp plan to what it would be the changes for the blue and the minimum required
Yes.
to maintain the 11 million
Definitely.
impact fees.
I'm sorry, eventually we would, I'm trying to figure out, what do you need for tomorrow night?
What do we
can
have, the bare minimum that we have to change to preserve traffic impact fees?
You would like a red line?
Yes.
Version of it.
Yeah, we need to.
And if you can't do that, Tell us.
I'm not sure that we can complete it all, but we certainly will start.
We'll see what we can.
Because you
come up
don't
with
need to
by-
make a decision tomorrow.
I want to go, Councilmember Valderrama has a question, but I want to clarify just on that issue. Tomorrow, we're going through the log. That was how we were going to conduct the meeting tomorrow, right? We were going to go through the log and the items, and the idea of this was to really convert this into the log so that we focused on those items that would make the
That's right.
difference
That's-
of getting
that's correct.
to this end. And so
there's no
I
correlation
understand.
to the log. That's the problem.
That's correct.
Well, that's what we're asking them to do, though.
If you can correlate it with the log, we can
That's
probably
right.
have the discussion tomorrow on that.
Okay.
That's fair.
And the only other,
trying to
so the slight amendment is that we're also requesting the green items only as they apply to the roads around Klahani. So Issaquah Falls City, Klahani roads, and Issaquah Pine Lake. For example, there are intersections on Issaquah Falls City that we would also include along with including the actual road itself. So if that's clear?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, just going back, as you called it, to fuzzy memory.
Yeah.
The comment that was done as far as when we put it on the tip, it was specifically cited that once it came in, Klahani came into the city of Sammamish, those would be priority projects. And in fact, that was covered in the media because it was controversial since we did not own it at that time. But the council specifically cited as one of their incentives for recognizing the advantage of coming home to roost, that they would be coming in and those would be recognized. So that was the spirit, the direct intent, and the direction of the council to be. So I go back to say, hey, if it's on there showing, that was the intent of the council, and we were criticized and we were praised from both sides for doing that at that time.
Ramiro, I agree with you because having been part of this process, as was done, this was one of the major elements that we've advanced as far as why we wanted to have Klahani in the fold to begin with, was so we could fix this Blinken Road.
Absolutely. And they were going to pay their own way.
Okay, so could we get just a summary of what we're going to have for tomorrow?
I think you'll find out tomorrow.
I just quickly, just to make sure that we know that what the staff will be providing.
What's the staff think they're bringing back at this point?
So we want to get it clear. So if I'm off, correct me, please. So what we're going to do is try to match the log with the blue and the green as it pertains to Klahani, so that you can have a valuable discussion on that part. We're working on getting the segment comparison. So Victor was going to try and run that tomorrow, correct? Okay, so we'll have that for you. We had a couple of legal question answers that we're going to follow up on, and I'll get the page numbers afterwards to make sure I have them. So we'll follow up with those. Those were the things that I saw we were going to do tomorrow, or heard that we we're going to do tomorrow. Is there anything else? Did I miss anything?
I think that's it.
Okay,
Okay.
all right. Thank you. My only comment would be the log, the colored log. I'm wondering if we could get that even emailed to us early if possible, so that the first time that we don't see it is here.
We'll do our best
if
to
possible.
feed you information as we have it available. We'll do our best.
I see no other questions. And I think that was the end of our agenda.
Great.
I was ready
We
to
probably
go.
only let him get into like 3 or 4 slides. He's probably got 10 more.
Okay.
But now I see that we are about 9 minutes off.
So are we done?
Just keeping track for the council, that's all.
Are we done with the slide? Is there anything?
Do you have any more substance?
You're 11 minutes next.
We just have the schedule, oops. We just have the schedule slide, I think, somewhere in there.
Let's just do the schedule slide.
Okay.
There it is. So we're October 2nd, right in the middle. We'll have the second reading and the opening of the public hearing tomorrow, and then there will be a third reading on November 21st, where we will be requesting adoption of the consolidated.
Or that third reading would be the final reading. I would classify it that way.
Unless we have a third one in between.
Exactly. So I would say that I would replace the word third with final reading of the ordinance.
Okay, yeah. Can I make one clarifying point to something Cheryl said? The public hearing was opened back in July and continued to tomorrow. So just a point of clarification there.
Continue it again.
And also, sort of looking at Kendra, I meant to mention earlier, is that we will actually start the discussion about Table T8, what drives the model at next week's meeting. So it's not like this is going to be set aside for a year. We're starting next Wednesday, the 11th, whenever that is.
At the technical meeting.
At the technical meeting. So we're actually starting really in-depth conversation about ultimately what the council wants in terms of measurement. So the couple meetings ago when Kendra was here and we were talking about what do you want your system, what do you want to measure? And that actually set the stage now for moving forward and actually developing the engineers, stuff the engineers need in order to implement it.
But just to clarify, my concern was not that we weren't discussing it, it's the implementation, which is why I asked if it had to go
Yes.
back through the comp plan docket to ultimately be adopted
That's
and
correct.
be
You are
utilized.
correct. You are correct,
And
yes.
and so that, I think, at that meeting last week or 2 weeks ago that we had, they stated 2019.
Right, you're correct.
So-
You're correct on that one. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. I see adjournment.
Great.
Are there any questions before we leave for tomorrow?